One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is the whole idea of the importance of family structure in the Roman world that Paul was operating in. And in that world, think of the terrace houses that we saw today. The father of the house really ruled the roost, to be very explicit about it. Everything flowed from him. His wife, of course, was a good, big helper in working with the servants, but in a house like the ones that we were seeing today, he was the top person who was in charge of the worship of the ancestors, which started the day. The wife might be in charge of some of the servants along the way, and typically when a day started, they would worship the ancestors and their local deity, and then people would come and visit the house, and the doors of the house were open, so literally people walking by could look inside and ooh and ah at all the furniture and the belongings that were there. And there were people who were typically indebted to such a person. You would think of the head of the house, a very elite person, as being what we would call the benefactor, the one who gives gifts, and people who receive the gifts are what we would call clients. And so they're the ones who are receiving the gifts. And as that happens, the clients are typically somewhat indebted to the benefactors. And so when the benefactor would go out into the streets, let's say it's the father house, these people would follow behind, and you'd have an entourage as you're moving along. If you were going to the boule, for example, you would have the entourage that would follow you. And so there was quite a bit of status in terms of the number that you would have in your entourage following you. And in those houses, there was a special room that was set aside for people to come and to visit or to conduct business with the head of the household. Someone was asking about whether slaves had special quarters. Not necessarily so. Sometimes they just had a straw mat or something, and they would curl up on the floor. And so their days were very, very long, obviously lasting longer than the household members would last, and starting before the household members even rose from bed. In terms of slaves, or people, let's call them slaves, they would be involved in cooking. There were some people who were involved in the teaching of the children, particularly a pedagogue who might be working with particularly the male sons, the sons of the family. And those types of people, and the wet nurses, the Roman women weren't too keen on breastfeeding, and so they had slaves who would do that for them. You can imagine that intimate connection with the children of the house oftentimes led to some freedom along the way. Slaves would typically receive a small sum of money called a pecuniarium, and they could accumulate that, and eventually the master of the house might free the slave. If that would happen, the slave was indebted to that master, might even receive the name of the master, and might even work for the master for several days of the year. And some of those slaves, remember the gate that we saw, the two gates that we saw by the library, and three gates, the Mazios gate. Osjan reminded us that these were freed slaves from Rome who became very, very wealthy. The tricky part was that in a city like Ephesus, the elite of the city were basically the elite because of family ties and heritage. And so you were born into an elite family. You could become very wealthy as a freed slave, but you would never quite attain the same status as one of the elite families. So that's something to keep in mind. The percentage of Christians who were from slavery, let's say, and became Christians, or from the crafts, let's say, and became Christians, or the upper class became Christians, we're not certain about. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, not all of you were wise and not all of you were rich, and so the implication seems to be that they were from the lower class. Many of them were from the lower classes of society. But can you imagine what would happen if let's say a wife became a Christian? Well, what would this mean? She was totally subservient to her husband. but yet she's now a Christian. She has this new faith, and she's rebelling against her husband. She's rebelling against the household gods. She's rebelling against the whole culture. And it's somewhat hard in my mind's eye to even think about a person, a woman like that, maybe inviting people into her home for a Christian gathering, unless she was really able to get her husband on her side. I use that as an illustration because becoming a convert to Christianity in some instances was not real simple, and it had social costs that were involved. If the head of the household became a Christian, the father, then that would seem to imply that other members of the household would follow in his footsteps. But you can see the difference, how that would work in a family structure such as might be found at Ephesus or in Corinth from the elite of the city. When we're thinking of those houses too, we were trying to just muse a little bit as to how many Christians or how many people could fit into a house like that. We do know that there really was a pecking order in terms of people, in terms of their social status. And Paul writes about there's neither slave nor free, male nor female, and so forth. That had real implications for the culture that or the early Christians were coming out of or were still embedded in, but yet were now called to more egalitarian principles as members of the body of Christ. When you, in Pliny, when he describes people coming to a dinner, he describes how, let's say in a triclinium, the three benches that you have around, you would have 9 people laying on these couches. The servants would come and they would serve you your meal. There would be much wine flowing. There would be entertainment. I'll come back to a little bit of that later in our travels. But there was a whole pecking order. So if you were lower on the pecking order in terms of your status, you would have a certain place on the triclinium where others would have a different place. And Pliny talks about how the wine was poured ahead of time, so those who were in good stead, the upper elite associated with the head of the house, they received the better wine, and there were others who, although invited, they were not as elite, so they would not get as good wine. So even within the upper class, as you were coming to a meal like that in a triclinium, there was a division there. Well, can you imagine what this meant when Christians were gathering? Look down mentally on the houses that we saw today, with the atrium and the court, the shaded area around it, the rooms leading off of it. So let's say a church was meeting in there. How many people could you fit? 30, 40, 50, something like that? And then the slaves are coming in. If you were the head of the household and were entertaining, and this was your entertainment at the church, and a meal was being ordered, would you seat people in different places based upon their social status? And if that's the case, then, some people might be getting more food and other people might be not getting so much food. When you read 1 Corinthians, you'll see some of this popping up because, Paul says, well, if you're hungry, eat at home and then come to the meeting. So I see that running in the background of a book like 1 Corinthians, which I think is really quite interesting as we meditate or just kind of muse on what's going on in these early gatherings at, let's say, an elite house. Now, in addition to that, at Ephesus, I just came across this last year. Actually, the book has just been published this last year. But there's a man named Hoag, H-O-A-G, who published his doctoral dissertation. It was published, he wrote it for a school in England. The name escapes me right now. But it had to do with a book that was known for many, many years. It's called Ephesiatica, which is really hard for me to say, and I don't even think I'm saying it right. But it's basically something to do with Ephesus that was written by a man named Xenophon. And this book was dated by scholarship, and I'm thinking back now into the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. as a book that was dated to around 150 AD. However, recent scholarship, this is apart from Hogue, has suggested that, it maintains, not just suggested, but maintains that this book was written around 50 AD. Well, guess what? That's right smack in the period when Paul was at Ephesus. And so this particular book, it's interesting because it's a love story about a young woman whose name was Anthea and her lover called Habracomes. And these two people, it describes their falling in love. And as it's describing their falling in love, Anthea is the most beautiful girl in Ephesus. And it talks about how they go to, they participate in the processions for Artemis. And this adds all kinds of new knowledge to that, because these processions happened very frequently, evidently. And this Anthea, she was dressed up in the finest garb. She was so beautiful, she was radiant. She was maybe 12 or 14 years old, marriageable age. And she had her hair decorated like Artemis. Remember, I had you look at the hairstyle? And Xenophon, he's waxing eloquent about this person and says she was so beautiful and looked so much like the goddess, they even almost worshipped her. She was from a very, very wealthy family, and there were other ladies, or young girls, young girls who were participating in this. And on the other side of the coin, Habracomes, he was a young male who was of marriageable age, a little bit older, but he was, of course, the most handsome. And these two were looking at each other and winking at each other, and he would go to the Artemis temple just so he could see Anthea. And so there's the description of this procession of going to the temple and how provisions were provided by their families for the sacrifice, and then that would be distributed to people who had come to worship. And so the privilege of doing the sacrifices to Artemis was basically reserved for the very, very elite of the city. And Hogue maintains that the elite of the city were literally tied to the worship of Artemis, and Artemis was tied to them. Now, in addition, when you think about the Temple of Artemis, that was a royal treasury. And that was the place where people, not only from the Ephesus region, but other regions, would bring their money for safekeeping. And it's interesting that when we read in the book of Acts about the riot in the theater, the clerk of the city says, well, these people aren't temple robbers, okay? But, you know, the money is kept in the temple. So there's a whole banking industry. I think Osjan pointed this out. So I paused for a second in my story, but when you stop and think about it, the temple was a whole commercial enterprise, being the banking industry, the silversmiths, the processions, the pilgrims that were coming there to worship, and then, of course, the harbor, which unfortunately was being silted up, but that was connections to Rome and other places to the east, or to the west. I also paused in the story for a second. Mary, remind me where I'm at. That's a joke. Anyhow, that at Ephesus, almost all of the inscriptions are in Greek, not Latin. Well, it was Rome that was ruling, but Rome was smart enough to let Ephesus maintain their Greek traditions. And they, you know, as long as you don't riot, as long as you stay in the fold, no problem. And so that's an interesting indication that Ephesus had maintained a good portion of their Greek background. Well, in the story of these two, unfortunately, well, they had it, let's put it this way. Their parents went to Artemis, and there was an oracle from the deity. And the oracle said that there would be problems and that there would be a separation, but that there would be a happy ending. And these two were sent off after marriage, which was obviously a big affair, to Rhodes. And unfortunately, along the way, this is where the story hugely gets complicated, that they were separated, they were caught by pirates, there's just all kinds of harrowing tales.
It's kind of like an old Doris Day movie, you know. Will she have sex with this person or not? And, will her lover maintain his chastity and so forth? Do you know Doris Day, or is that something maybe two of you do? Mary still watches the reruns a lot. But anyhow, eventually they're reunited and they come back to Ephesus. And along the way, they even meet people from Ephesus. For example, Thea, she says, "I swear by Artemis if you help me." And so they were, this connection with the city and people of the city is all over the Mediterranean. So it's an interesting insight that way. And so Hogue, when he's dealing with this, is very, very interested, particularly in the connection with the letter of 1 Timothy. Now, Hogue doesn't say that Paul wrote Timothy. The authorship of Timothy, as you read in Fontaine-Redish, they say it's kind of like a Pauline school rather than penned by the apostle himself. I don't really want to go down that route. Personally, I think that Paul certainly could have written it during his last imprisonment, and then 2 Timothy would be his final letter. But in any case, Hogue takes some of the content of this letter. I mean, this is new stuff that people are really excited about for interpreting the New Testament. And when you look at 1 Timothy, there are some very problematic passages, particularly in light of some of the discussions that we've had in North America about the role of women in the church and so forth. But let me read to you from 1 Timothy chapter 2, starting at verse 9. "I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modesty, discreetly, not with braided hair, nor gold pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works, as befits a woman making claim to godliness." The word that's used there for braided hair is literally used for the braided hair of Artemis. Did you catch that? Paul is writing to probably a few, at least elite women, who have become Christians, and they're not supposed to behave that way anymore. Do you see what I mean? They're not supposed to be going to the temple of Artemis. They're not supposed to be sprucing themselves up for Artemis, but they're to behave discreetly, working good works, those that claim godliness. "Let a woman receive instruction with submissiveness." Well, in this love story, the women, we find out, are very, very vocal about Artemis. And they're very much in tune with teaching and preaching and promoting Artemis, giving instruction about Artemis. Paul says, "Let a woman receive instruction with entire submissiveness. I will not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet." This is contrary to what was going on in this love story that I've been describing to you. And then the next part. Well, in the Artemis way of things, it's almost a fusion with Artemis, an Egyptian deity named Isis. But in any case, in that particular realm of things, it was in creation, after creation, it was the man, guess what, who was deceived. Well, what does Paul write? For it was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. In the Artemis way of things, it's vice versa. It was not Adam who was deceived, vice versa in the Artemis myth, but the woman, being quite deceived, fell into transgression. "The woman shall be preserved through the bearing of children, if they continue in faith and love and sanctity with self-restraint." Well, Artemis is the goddess of childbirth. These people were worried. If I become a Christian and I bear children, will I receive the wrath of Artemis? Paul says, no, you are protected. Okay? So there's a lot going on there, at least I've tried to indicate it in a feeble way here, regarding some new information about the status of people and the whole worship of Artemis, and how 1 Timothy, so much of it is countercultural.
When you come to the qualifications of leadership in the church, for the qualifications for working being a priest in the Artemis temple, it was basically the family that you were born into. When you, and there's also evidence in the story, as well as in the inscriptions from Ephesus, and there are hundreds of them, Greek mainly, but there's evidence that people who were able to be in the priesthood of Artemis, the curates, remember you heard that word earlier, oftentimes they did it for selfish gain. So when Paul goes through qualifications for leadership, it's not family status, it's not for special gain, but it's for servanthood. And that, of course, it resonates just all through the New Testament. And so it's easy to re-emphasize that, and maybe it's easy to say, yes, I've seen this here and there and there in the New Testament, but it certainly is countercultural to what was going on there at Ephesus. So anyhow, we have new insights really into the whole lifestyle of the Ephesians. So I didn't want to pass up the chance to share it, at least my way, with you at this point. So there you go, sports fans. Yeah.